Thank you, Ron, and thank you to the lifelong learners for giving me the opportunity to come and share this information today. I always, take the opportunity when I can because it's something that bovine TB is something that we hear a lot about, and maybe, it's just kind of a background thing that we never paid attention to, or we learned about it and forgot, and it's ever changing. So again, thank you for the opportunity to give you some information today. As Ron said, my name is Emily Sewell. I am the DNR's wildlife health specialist for the northern Lower Peninsula, and I focus on bovine tuberculosis. And as Ron mentioned, that means working with the Department of Agricultural and Rural Development, with our private landowners, be those landowners agricultural producers, cattle producers, or hunters, working with all those groups and others to address bovine tuberculosis. My job specifically is with deer, but there's so many linkages throughout the community. It's hard to just tease stuff out sometimes with this. So next slide, and then we'll skip right past that. First, I just wanted to kind of go over and give a refresher or some basic intro to the basics of bovine tuberculosis before we kind of proceed a little bit. So next slide, please. As you may or may not know, bovine TB is a zoonotic disease. And so, we learned maybe with COVID or with other diseases, that means it's a disease that can be transmitted from animals to people and even sometimes from people back to animals. And it's a chronic, slow-growing infectious disease. So I'll give a little more information later, but that kind of complicates finding it and managing the disease. Bovine TB is caused by a mycobacterium. So that means it's not just a regular old bacteria, but it has mycolic acid that kind of helps make this waxy coating around it. So unlike some other bacteria that don't have that protection, it makes that bacteria particularly persistent in the environment. So things that might normally kill other bacteria that are on, a doorknob or out on, the ground or in the soil, don't do the best job with bovine tuberculosis. And so these 4 factors make this an incredibly difficult disease to manage and address and potentially eradicate if that's what the goal is. We're not the only place in the world that has it. There are several other countries that deal with the disease, both in human populations, wildlife populations. But in the United States, what I'm talking about is bovine tuberculosis. We also have human tuberculosis that people are familiar with, and there's also avian tuberculosis as well. So we're focusing on bovine TB today, and that's what my job and the DNR and Department of Agriculture and Rural Development kind of co-manage and work together on, because our primary concern with this is our cattle health and then the health of our wildlife, particularly our white-tailed deer and the spillover between the deer to the cattle and then potentially deer or cattle to people. So those 2 departments within the state of Michigan work together on this. So I said it's resistant to things in the environment that can kill it. So what can we do to get rid of it if we find it somewhere? Exposure to UV radiation, prolonged exposure to UV radiation, really desiccates the bacteria and that waxy coating and the bacteria itself, and antibiotic treatment. So in humans, if we get bovine tuberculosis or human tuberculosis, we can get a long prescription for antibiotics that is quite costly, but there is antibiotic treatment in the United States. We do not, fortunately, have the issue of antibiotic resistant bovine TB in other countries, especially less developed countries that deal with this quite a bit in their human population. That is a problem, and it's a pretty big deal worldwide. We're kind of isolated from this disease in the United States because of all the protocols that we have, because of all the things we do with our food supply and how the health department intervenes when we find infections. But in other countries, that's not the case. And so it is a very important disease worldwide. It's something that's kind of faded from our memory here in the United States, but that is not the case in other countries for sure. So what are some signs of bovine TB? I'm going to talk specifically about deer right now, but One of the most important things to remember as far as, does this deer have TB, is most of the time you can't tell just by looking at the deer. Most infected deer appear healthy. So I need to make the distinction between a latent infection and actually having the disease. So deer, humans, cattle, pretty much all mammals can get bovine tuberculosis. And you can be exposed to it and be infected. And so the bacterium can be in your body, and your immune system is kind of keeping it at bay and taking care of it. And until you become immune suppressed or there's some very serious illness, or potentially just with age, sometimes your immune system can't suppress the bacteria anymore, and then it progresses to actually having the disease. That's why when we listen to that, voice on all the many drug commercials, it says, make sure you're tested for bovine TB before you start this medication, because some of those medications can suppress your immune system. And if you had TB as a latent infection and you didn't know it, then you might progress toward or to having the disease because of taking that medication, and your immune system just can't keep it at bay anymore. So same thing in deer. They can be exposed to it. They can have bovine tuberculosis in their body. And unless we have a really severe winter where they are severely stressed, or some other event, maybe stressor happens, they could be just fine and you would never know. And you would harvest that deer, and unless you submitted it for testing through one of our check stations, you would never know that it had TB. Sometimes when somebody field dresses a deer, they see what we ask hunters to look for, which are the lesions in the chest, so on the rib cage, on the lungs. You see next slide, please. You see, I didn't want to leave that one too long after lunch. So you'll see the white spots on the lungs sometimes, again, the rib cage, other internal organs. But that's not all the time. But if you see that is potentially bovine tuberculosis. And so if you are a hunter, you would want to stop what you're doing, sanitize your hands and take that deer to a check station if you can, or make arrangements with the DNR so that we could test it. As you can imagine, if your lungs have these lesions in them, you're probably going to have some difficulty breathing, and there's going to be some coughing, sneezing, nasal discharge. All that is, potentially expelling that mycobacterium into the air for other deer if they're nearby, or on the, food that you're eating that another deer could eat. As it progresses, emaciation, depression, intolerance to exercise, just what you might think of as, a deer that's not right on the lands. It's just not quite behaving how a deer should, not neurologically, just from an energetic standpoint. And then the coughing and the sneezing as well. Next slide, please. So like I said, most deer look normal. On average, it kind of varies by year. Only about 40% of the deer that we find to be positive through our wildlife disease lab down in Lansing, through their testing of the deer, only about 40% of those actually had lesions outside the head, we say, but somewhere in that critter's body that a hunter would say, ooh, that's suspicious and I want to get that tested. So the other 60% of the time, we're just seeing signs of the disease in the lymph nodes that we test for in the head. So I don't know how many people here are hunters, and of those, how many have brought a deer to one of our check stations. But what the DNR does is collect the heads of deer for people interested in submitting them. And so we look kind of in the lab, kind of in the same area as where our tonsils are, for lymph nodes in the deer where we would most likely find TB first. And so that's how we detect it. Not any place a hunter would look, or we would want them to look, because we don't want you to go digging around and potentially expose yourself to that. So we never recommend hunters do that to check themselves. You just can submit the head to us through a check station, and we will safely do it in a biosecure lab and let you know. So that's just a good reminder to make sure that you get your deer checked for bovine TB if you are a hunter up here, because you can't. A lot of people say, I've hunted for 40 years and I've never seen anything, and you probably won't. So always important to get your deer's head submitted for testing. Next slide. It's just going to be a quick one. How does it spread? I kind of talked a little bit about this with the coughing and the sneezing. you can, or deer and cattle can spread bovine tuberculosis directly or indirectly. So directly, I think they kind of are self-explanatory, but there's an infected animal and a naive or uninfected animal. Coughing, sneezing, licking, and you're directly transmitting that bacteria from one to the other. And that is likely between two deer. It's not so likely between deer and cattle or deer and other wildlife. So indirect transmission is more likely for the disease to spread from deer to our cattle. So farmers are putting down their feed, and at night the cattle kind of walk away from it, and the deer creep in and they, cough and sneeze on it if they're infected, or just, a little bit of saliva, what fluids and respiratory droplets get on that feed. And then the next morning the cattle come and kind of sniff through and clean everything up, and they've potentially just ingested that. So on their, on salt and mineral licks, on feed, on stored feed, not just feed presented to the cattle. There's lots of ways for indirect spread of the disease, and certainly, I can't go over all of them, but that kind of gives you the picture of direct or indirect. Both of those methods of transmission are ways that bacteria gets spread around the landscape. Next slide, please. Thank you. Bovine TB is a density dependent disease. So that means the more deer or cattle or whatever the organism we have in one place, the more likely it is for that disease to spread. So when we do things like feed deer, bait deer, that congregates them at numbers that are not usually happening on their own or naturally on the landscape. And so that is a perfect way for that disease to spread among those deer, potentially direct transmission, potentially indirect. And it's another way to spread other diseases as well. We don't have chronic wasting disease up here. That's a bigger issue further downstate, but that's another disease that can be spread much more quickly when we congregate animals. And then also feeding sites and baiting sites are generally the same area again and again. So then we have issues with parasites and eating where, there's droppings. So there's lots of other reasons as well, but bovine TB up here is the big one, why we don't want to do that and why there is a feeding and baiting ban. Next slide, please. So I did say it persists in the environment for a long time. How long? There have been several studies that have tried to figure this out so we can do a better job of making sure that we change practices for cattle producers or hunters. And so one study isolated the bacteria on different types of feed materials, including corn, apples, potatoes, and they found it at 112 days. So that's a pretty long time for that bug to be out there on an apple. And certainly lots of opportunity for deer to come in contact with that after it's been deposited there by an infected one. There's various lengths reported, and it depends a lot on the conditions that were part of that study. So ideal conditions for bovine tuberculosis to persist in the environment is where there's no UV radiation. So the darker, the damper, and the cooler, the better. So we have a lot of swamps in this area, and they are dark and damp and pretty cool. So that's a great place for the bacteria to persist. And so we see 18 to 332 days in those studies. And the closer we are to ideal conditions, the closer we are to that longer end of the spectrum. And then a more recent study showed something that surprised me when it was published, that even on a straight block of salt, it was viable for up to 2 days, which was incredible to me. There's no organic matter, just a block of salt, and that bug could still be viable 2 days after it was deposited on there. And you mix, a little mineral lick for your cattle, so it's not just salt, and in more than 3 days it can hang out on there and still be viable. So the big take home there was a lot of cattle producers pasture their cattle and they'll just throw a salt block out there. So it's extra important to make sure then that we're not just leaving that salt or mineral where it's accessible to deer, because they certainly love those things. They're strongly attracted to them, and you're really concentrating then the deer and the cattle licking on one place, and very reasonable to expect that Deer could come in from the woods at night, lick on that salt or mineral block, and then the next morning the cows come out and lick on it too. And there you have it. They've swapped spit, as some of us say, on that, and that's not a good thing. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go over the history of it in our state real quick. If you want to skip ahead 2 slides, please. TB, bovine TB, is not an endemic disease to North America. So before 1994, only about 8 deer, mule deer or white-tailed deer, I don't know which of either it was, but about 8 deer were reported to have bovine tuberculosis. Then in 1975, a doe was harvested in Alpena County and was brought to the DNR because it looked, something wasn't right with it, and I wasn't around then, so I don't know if these were the exact words, but that's weird. that's not right. So kind of just generally, something that we thought, that was kind of an oddball maybe. And then in 1994, a 4-year-old buck in this county, in Alpena County, was harvested, and that's when we realized, okay, there's something going on. So shortly after that, then we started our statewide surveillance program. So hunter harvested deer, roadkill, all sorts of deer, dead deer, were submitted and examined to our wildlife health staff to check for the disease. And again, as many of you that hunt might be familiar, or even if you're not, we have check stations that hunters can use to submit their heads now for our surveillance program to surveil the state and understand where the disease is and what the prevalence is. Next slide. So I've been talking about deer, and cows a couple times, but all of our mammals here, all of our wildlife can potentially be infected with bovine tuberculosis. Research has shown that most of these other species are what we call a dead-end host. So they can get the bacteria. For example, a coyote could eat on a dead deer that was infected, and it can ingest the bacterium. It can become infected, but it does not then go on to shed it in the environment because of either biological or epidemiological reasons, or because of the social nature of that animal, whether it is or is not interacting with other species or its own, then that kind of isolates it to that one animal, and it's really not a further concern. Deer certainly are a reservoir, and it can spill over to cattle, as I said. Elk could potentially be in that situation like deer, because elk are a true herd animal and their ranges are so much greater than deer. That's a concern for the DNR, and that factors into our management of elk. So we designate certain hunt zones and times to specifically manage our elk so they don't drift east from where they are, where they could be picking up TB and then carrying it back to our elk herd. So it definitely could have implications on other wildlife, and we're trying to keep it right, unfortunately, where it is with the deer and maintain it so there are no issues with other wildlife. And we've had about, people ask, and I don't remember the exact number, but it's around 10 elk that we have had test positive for TB. All our elk heads are submitted for TB testing because there's such a small population and such a small number of elk are harvested that we can really check that much more carefully than we can the much larger deer population. And black bear, coyote, possum, raccoon, red fox, all of these have been found to have TB in Michigan. Our next slide, we kind of jump over to the other side, to the cattle side of things. For a long time, Michigan was considered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture to be TB-free, and that changed as we started to find bovine TB in the deer and then in the cattle on the landscape as well. So in the kind of 4 counties of Alcona, Alpena-Montmorency, and Oscoda County, that's the core area for TB, the modified accredited zone for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And for the Department of Natural Resources purposes, we include Presque County in there as well to say that's where it's self-sustaining or now endemic in deer in those 5 counties. USDA looks at things a little bit differently, and they say that 4-county area that I said, Alcona, Alpena, Montmorency, and Oscoda, Those 4 counties are where the highest risk is for cattle, so they're a different zone than the rest of the state. But it has been found in other counties, like in the picture there, and this is an old map, I should have found one with Sheboygan County shaded in, because just last year, a TB positive herd was found there as well. So some of these are from traces. So when a cattle herd, say in Alpena County, is positive, the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development traces all the animals that were sold from there to figure out where they are. And then we need to deal with those animals and test them and see if they have TB. So sometimes that's how these other counties pop up and have TB, is because they bought an animal that was up here and it made its way out, despite our testing movement and surveillance testing in cattle. I think the red ones were from Indiana, so there were some roping cattle that were brought in, and that's how it got in those counties. These are really isolated, so those herds are tested and quarantined, and then we make sure it's not there anymore. And we also test the deer to make sure that in this new area where there normally isn't TB, it hasn't gone from the cattle out to the wildlife population. So it can go both ways, and we're always testing and trying to make sure that we know where it is, and we're keeping it in the Northeast where it unfortunately is, but I don't want to say we want it to stay, but we don't want to go outside of there. Next slide, please. So I talked about the surveillance and turning in heads. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture has what's called a Memorandum of Understanding with the DNR, Department of Agriculture and Rural Development in Michigan, and also Wildlife Services, which is part of USDA. And that really determines what our surveillance is going to be every year in deer. So by surveillance, I mean how many deer heads are we going to need to collect from our hunters to test to see if we have bovine TB, and where. So 2019, I'll say, was our last normal year. The map shows where we have certain goals or quotas. We want a certain number of deer from. By hitting that certain number, it allows us to report then with confidence the prevalence of the disease to a certain level. So because we test the 2,800 deer in those yellow counties, that 4-county core area I talked about, we can say down to the 1/10% what the prevalence is, and those numbers allow us to do that. So there's some statistical importance to why we have those numbers specifically. So in 2019, like we always have, we want to check those 4 counties in the core area. And then recently we started checking in the orange counties that surround it. The U.S. Department of Agriculture was concerned that potentially it could be spreading out of the core area. So they wanted the Department of Natural Resources to test deer in that orange kind of sea around there, those adjacent counties, to see. And then if we had an infected cattle herd, that's what those little circles are, is where there was a herd. So we're testing the deer to make sure it didn't spill over from those those cattle to the deer. And typically we test thousands and thousands of deer, both in those zones, and then anyone in the state that harvests a deer can submit it for TB testing. So we have a really good idea. We're not just getting samples from those highlighted areas from all over the state. People can, it's voluntary. So in 2019, statewide, we tested over the entire state of Michigan, a little over 25,000 deer. All deer that go to the lab and get tested for chronic wasting disease also get tested for CWD. So when we started testing for chronic wasting disease downstate, we got a lot more TB samples from downstate too, that just reaffirmed that it's not down there. TB isn't anyways. Last year, as we know, was a different year for a lot of reasons for everybody. And so next slide, please. Our total dropped from that 25,000 I just said to a total statewide of 7,000 deer tested. So many fewer deer were taken to check stations, and unfortunately we didn't make some of those quotas that we really needed to. So the title of this is Impacts and Implications, and the implication of that, or the impact of that, is that some cattle herds in those orange counties where we didn't meet the quotas incurred extra testing as part of that agreement between USDA and the state of Michigan. That's the consequence for not reaching those quotas. So there are some very tangible impacts to both our hunters and our cattle producers and our communities as well with this disease, and that's just one of them. So this is,
Emily,
yes.
You've got a pale yellow circle up northwestern Michigan.
In Emmett, yes.
3 bluish ones down below. Tell me what those circles are.
Those would be where we had a cattle herd that was positive. And so then we, in accordance with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's MOU with the state, it says we have to test for a certain number of years, a certain number of miles. So a 10-mile radius from where that herd was, we have to test for 3 years the deer to make sure that the disease didn't spill over from the infected herd to the deer. So that's what those circles are.
So there are no infected, or there in 2020, there were no infected herds in northeast Michigan.
Deer.
No infected cattle.
There, I'm less familiar with the numbers for cattle. We have 3 infected herds that are like on the books right now. So in our agreement, we're allowed to have that many TB positive herds, and then kind of once we go past what those limits are with our agreement, then there's consequences for our zoning potentially. So we have had over the last year or two, we have had a few TB positive cattle herds pop up, including one in Alcona, one in Alpena, one in Sheboygan. I don't remember the years exactly to know which is where, but we have had some cattle herds recently.
All the cattle, or do they all have to be taken down?
If you don't mind waiting, I have that on a slide later, so that way I'll make sure it's all in order, but I will cover that. Do not worry.
How do you test over 1,000 deer? Do they go out in the field?
It's all voluntary from our hunters, so thank you to anybody here who has hunted and submitted ahead.
The hunters bring it.
Yep, and on some of the permits that the DNR issues, a condition of the permit is that the head has to be submitted for testing for some of our extra shooting beyond just what you can buy tags for during hunting season. So yes, hunters can take the head from their deer, bring the deer to a check station, and we'll cut the head off, but heads at check stations get collected, they go down to the lab, and then the lab drowns in truckloads of deer heads for months and dedicate all their life from October through December, just looking at deer heads and looking for the disease. So that's how we do it. With cattle, it's very different. Their surveillance is in live animals. Anything else other than your question, which we'll get to later? Okay, next slide, please. So this is a little bit tiny. Well, maybe it's tinier for me than it is for you. But since we started back in 1995 with our surveillance program, this just kind of outlines how many deer have been positive out of the total that have been tested. It's the number in the right-hand column, the total tested, has fluctuated. And again, some of that has to do with back in 2016 to 2019, our testing for chronic wasting disease, especially in the southern part of the state. So we got a huge influx of samples because we automatically test for TB while those heads are at the lab. So we started seeing a lot more samples in those few years. The grand total is over 220,000 deer since 1995 that we have tested for TB in the state, and almost 950 of those have been positive. So really, it is a pretty low level on the landscape. I'll show the percentages, the prevalence, apparent prevalence of the disease. Depending on where you are, it can be more prevalent than other areas, but in general, a low level on the landscape. But the caveat then is that it's that slow growing chronic disease we have a hard time managing, and so or detecting just with our own eyes or seeing the deer. So that small percentage really is a big deal. It doesn't seem like it's that big a deal when you look at the numbers. And that would be our epidemiologist that recently retired, Dan O'Brien, says, oh, that's not the right caption for that. But anyways, those were severely lesioned lungs from a TB infected critter that was down in the lab. And that's how they suit up when they're looking at those heads. Next slide, please. So this just kind of takes that data, the number of heads that are tested and the number that were positive, and we divide the positive by the number that were tested to give us the prevalence. So how many were positive out of the whole pool there? And in the core area for DNR's management, Deer Management Unit 452, which are kind of the corners of Alpena, Alpena-Montmorency, and Oscoda there, inside that orange, that's the core area. That's where the prevalence is highest, has been, continues to be the highest. So we see back in 1995, when we first started, almost 5% of the deer on the landscape that we tested were infected with bovine TB. It dropped down, and that's in part to the feeding and baiting ban, changes in number of deer that could, antlerless deer that could be harvested, and the seasons, all the different modifications that the DNR can make to address deer harvest that were put in place in this area once we found bovine tuberculosis. Yes?
In that core area, how much of that is state-owned property?
Very little. So I believe it's 97% is private. A lot of people refer to that as club country, right? Because, yes, yep. Just about, yep, just about. And so that's an excellent point. It makes it not impossible. It is, we rely very heavily on private landowners and people following, baiting and feeding bans and harvesting antlerless deer to make those changes on the landscape, because there is so little public land that, the DNR doesn't have control over much of it. So that,
any estimates to how many hunters hunt in that area?
we do know, and I am not a keep numbers in my head kind of girl. So I could certainly provide that for you, and we do have estimates. Certainly, I just don't know.
Turtle Lake with 27,000 acres, I think they have 13 members.
I don't know the membership for
Lazy Acres Hunt Camp had 7, okay, I was a member there, and we have 440 acres, okay. There's some huge, big 8 land company, I think they had 800 acres, so there's some huge chunks of property in there.
Yes.
And the amount of people, for God's sake, you could hold in your hand.
Yes.
Okay, you meant that number one.
Yes. Yep. You're absolutely right that there are some very large land holdings there, and what the DNR would recommend, and perhaps some other deer managers might recommend as far as appropriate antlerless harvest given a density dependent disease is not as high as we would hope it to be. And Michigan certainly is what we say a buck centric state. So most people are out there to shoot a buck, and shooting a buck is not what's going to change the population. So does, harvest of does is what really impacts the population, and that reproduction from that doe is what's driving the increase. So when all we do is, want to shoot our buck, and we have a lot of property, you're right, that does not really provide any impact on the deer density or in stopping or reducing the spread of the disease. Yes, yep, it can, yep. So over the years then, from the mid-90s to, down almost to 10 years ago, all the efforts that had been made started to drive the prevalence down on the landscape. So we were down regularly to below 2% in 2014. We were at 1%. And that was really encouraging. We felt like, we're on the right track. Like I said, it's a difficult disease to manage. It's been around, human tuberculosis has been around thousands of years. It's a tough one. And so it's not something that we're gonna, in a couple of years, get rid of. So this was good progress going from, 4.9% down to below 2% consistently. That was actually really good progress. To the public, it might seem like we're spinning our wheels and we haven't gotten rid of it yet, but progress was made. And the DNR looks at 5-year trends in the disease to kind of help guide our management a little. And so if we look at the bottom section where it's highlighted, the outlook is not so great. So some of the progress that we made is starting to, seep away a little bit. In the core area, we've been above 2% apparent prevalence in that core area for the past 5 years. So that's a little concerning to us. Outside of there, the rest of that 5-county area, it's always much lower. And so we're still concerned there as well. A couple years ago, 0.6% struck us back in 2017 as being red flag and a little bit higher than what we had normally seen. In fact, we hadn't seen anything close to that since around 2000, 2001. So watching that as well, and that I think is part of what concerned U.S. Department of Agriculture, that potentially this could be spreading 0.4, 0.3, 0.6% outside of the core area. So the harvest regulations here have been and continue to be pretty liberal compared to the rest of the state as far as deer harvest and antlerless deer harvest. Next slide, please. So all these numbers are put into a graph that's easier to see the trend. And so I said we focus on the most recent 5 years. So if you click one more time, a box will show up and just highlight that we can see that line is above that 2% on the y-axis there. And we had been making really good progress, and now we're kind of leveled out and not headed exactly in the direction that we want to be. What compounds this issue is that we continue to lose hunters. This is not just a TB area, a statewide, or not just a TB issue, but it's a statewide and a nationwide phenomena. And hunters are just kind of aging out. Our baby boomer generation brought us a large number of hunters, and they just aren't being replaced by the younger folks. And so we're just kind of seeing that trend occur. So over the last 20 years, the northern Lower Peninsula, so not just this TB area, but the northern Lower Peninsula in general, in the last 20 years has lost about 35% of our hunters. That's a big chunk. And so when we think of people out in the woods harvesting those antlerless deer, a third of them are gone and are not there to do that for us. So that kind of compounds this problem of the prevalence is not going in the right direction, and we're losing those people that can help us address that. So what does all this mean? Next slide, please. Michigan's TB goals. What is the DNR's goal for TB? So our primary goal right now is to eliminate the risk of transmission from deer to livestock. So as a partner with the Department of Agriculture, and because of the potential human health aspects and the issues that this can cause to the cattle industry, livestock industry, the first thing we want to do is stop that spread where we can from deer to livestock. And we work with Department of Agriculture to do that. The next goal after that is to reduce the prevalence in the periphery, kind of on the outside. We don't want it to spread from where it is. Obviously, once it's established, it's harder to get rid of than when it's starting to move out. So that's the next goal. And then finally, we do want to reduce the prevalence in the core area for obvious reasons. Next slide, please. So what does that mean? What are we doing? I kind of touched on this a little bit. Next slide. After we, after we detected the disease in the Northeast and did some surveillance, we said, hey, we're going to designate a whole deer management unit up there where we find TB the most. So Presque and then Iosco County on top and below of that 4-county area that we've been talking about. So those 6 counties comprise DMU 487. And then we carve out DMU 452, that core area in the middle. So we can design regulations, and we can create different harvest limits for that area compared to the rest of the state where we don't quite have the issue. So in 1995, next slide, DMU 487, Deer Management Unit 87, Deer Management Unit 487 was created. Next slide. So then how are we reducing the density? I said before, changing seasons. So we have early and late antlerless seasons. So, before and after our traditional firearm season, there's antlerless harvest opportunity. We have more liberal license for private land, especially. Again, 97% of that core area is private land. So we got to make sure that those people have opportunity to shoot deer if they want. We have extra permits that can be issued to our agricultural producers, our cattle farmers, landowners, our hunters in general. And then of course the feeding and baiting ban to stop that spread of the disease. These other things get at the density of the deer on the landscape. Next slide, on the cattle side of things, we talked about the 4-county area, the modified accredited zone. That means the rules for cattle are very different there because USDA has these different TB zones. And so the rest of the state at this point is considered the accredited free. So we're in the rest of the state that's in green there is in the free zone. However, those of us that are in the orange counties that have cattle have additional movement and testing requirements and lots of hoops to jump through that their counterparts in the green shaded counties do not. Next slide. Well, I guess same slide. Push the button, we'll zoom in. So one of those things is increased biosecurity in that area. So this is a map of, it looks very similar to DMU 452. In fact, the red dotted line is that deer management core area 452. Department of Agriculture and Rural Development created an extra biosecurity program for farms in their core area, which is that yellow shaded area. So very similar to the DNR's core area, but just kind of expanded in a few areas on the landscape. And so these farms have to kind of go above and beyond what farms in the whole orange counties have to do to improve their biosecurity. So prevent access of deer to the feed, the water, the salt, the mineral, the pasture, ways that that bacteria can get passed from the deer to the cattle. All the farms in the orange areas that sell cattle commercially go through that. It's called the Wildlife Risk Mitigation Program. In the yellow shaded area, over the past several years, all the farms that wanted to continue selling cattle commercially and getting those, cattle they're raising into the public food supply need to participate in the enhanced wildlife biosecurity program. So extra, kind of a more tailored approach than just the general program that was laid out in orange, always trying to do better, always trying to improve, because it's important for us to show the U.S. Department of Agriculture that we're still working toward addressing this disease. We're not just sitting on our heels and letting things happen. We're doing the best we can on our farms and with the deer to mitigate the spread of the disease. Next slide. So as I said, I'll start at the bottom, improve farm biosecurity, changes to those practices so the deer aren't getting at what the cattle have access to and spreading that bacteria to them. That means potentially changes to the farm practices or changes in farm infrastructure. Sometimes there's cost share available for fencing to either enclose the cattle area, so they're behind a 8-foot fence and it's very unlikely the deer are going to jump into where the cattle are, or potentially 3-dimensional fencing that can deter the deer. They don't have the best depth perception, so if you have a row of fence and then another row of fence, they sometimes don't know what to do with that, and if you bait it with something and they put their nose on it, it's confusing and it hurt when they touched it, so they don't want to go there. Or in the past, there were some barns that were cost-shared, hoop barns. So it can be, again, this biosecurity can be changes to practices, it can be changes to infrastructure, maybe not putting your cattle out, in the swamp or in the woods, bringing your cattle in. It sounds easy, but all these things can be extremely difficult changes and expensive changes for cattle producers to make. It can completely change their operation because that then involves manure management and all these things when we bring cattle in closer together instead of spreading them out on the farm. So it's not easy for sure. And then part of the enhanced wildlife biosecurity program is Wildlife Services, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Wildlife Services deer surveillance and removal. So I'm sure many of you have heard about, the trucks that are out there at night with night vision, slaughtering all the deer. And what Wildlife Services is doing is going out to these farms on a regular basis. They have forward-looking infrared, so kind of like night vision, mounted to their trucks, and they go to these farms that are in the program. And from the road, they don't even have to go on a farm, but they can if they're given permission. They use the night vision to kind of see, are there deer coming into the barns? Are there deer next to the barns or in the cattle's pasture and the feeding areas? And if there are, then they talk to the farmer and say, hey, there are deer where it is not safe for them to be on your farm. You need to shoot them or we can shoot them for you. But the Department of Agriculture has said it is no longer acceptable. If you want to continue to sell cattle, to be allowing deer to get on your farm where they could be infecting your cattle, because there are serious consequences to the Northeast and to the state as well if we continue to get bovine TB infected cattle herds. So their tolerance from years ago has shrunk tremendously as we tighten things up and really try to minimize the number of cattle herds that we have. And then back to the top, kind of going out of order, in the 4-county area and Presque, there's whole herd surveillance testing. So thankfully, we don't have to cut the heads off all the cows to get TB results from them. They do a test in the live animal. So Department of Agriculture staff go, at a minimum, there's annual whole herd surveillance testing. So if you have a cattle herd and you're in Alpena County, once a year, you have to have your whole herd testing done. So any bovid that's 12 months or older needs to get tested, unless it's a not natural addition. So you got a new critter from somebody else that you didn't breed on your farm, and then 6 months and older, we got to test that one. So at least once a year, they're all getting tested for bovine tuberculosis. It's not a perfect test. It's about 85% effective. So it's not like you got the test and you're absolutely, you're good. You know your cattle are good. It is quite possible that it gets missed. And so that's the reality of the situation. And it's very stressful for cattle producers to go through both the testing and if their herd does get an infection. That is devastating. In addition, there's movement testing if you want to move the animals off your farm and out of the zone. There's so many more things that our cattle producers have to do and go through here than the rest of those counties that I showed that were in green. There's so much more that goes into raising cattle here and selling those cattle here, just to make sure that we're doing our best to prevent that disease from getting into the cattle and potentially causing some type of human impact. As I said, we don't have an issue like other countries do. The whole reason we pasteurize our milk is because of bovine tuberculosis. It was so rampant in our dairy cattle and people were getting so infected with it that's why we pasteurize milk. All the deer that get slaughtered and go through a USDA inspected plant, they're all getting checked. So we have steps in place through FDA and through USDA slaughter inspection to check these things that other countries maybe do not. And so we can be thankful here that we do have those things. It scares me when people say I'm raising my own cows here and I don't pasteurize, I drink the raw milk, and that's scary because that's what we did literally 100 years ago, and that's why we started pasteurizing milk, because that can very easily get transmitted to people through that. So we have things in place for the public food supply to help prevent that, and as a result, we don't see TB so much here anymore. Next slide. Oh, hey, that was it. That's my last one. Did I answer your question?
Yes.
Good enough. Thank you. Okay.
But most of those farms that raise they sell the milk to like an organic farm or something, they're highly infected.
Yes. Yep. So the dairy farms here certainly go through the whole herd surveillance testing. They also have different testing from, as far as milk quality goes. I don't know all the details, and specifics on that because I haven't been a milk inspector or done any job like that. But there are other certifications and qualifications that those dairy farms need to meet in order to get their milk into the public food supply. And yes, even the organic farms, that milk is pasteurized. In fact, when you look, the organic milk is ultra pasteurized, so it's cooked even longer and higher because that way it can stay on the shelf longer. It's recently more popular, but sometimes people, aren't as likely to buy organic milk because of the price. So if we pasteurize it longer, it can stay on the shelf longer. So that's why their expiration dates on organic milk cartons are generally much longer than the plastic cartons or the conventional milk.
Where's the cost for the testing,
Which, cattle or deer or both?
Yes.
So I cannot speak 100% for the the MDARD's cattle testing, so I don't want to misspeak on that. The Department of Natural Resources testing, I believe, comes out of our budget. It's not like a line item from the state of Michigan, I don't believe, from the general fund. So that comes out of the DNR's Wildlife Division's budget, and I don't know exactly where those dollars are from. So I wish I could answer that, and I can't. I know I knew at one point, but that's escaped me.
But are farmers responsible for having their herds tested each year or whatever?
Good question. Good question. So cattle producers in the TB zone where we require the testing, no, they do not. You can have a state of Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development has veterinarians and field staff that go out and do the testing at no cost. So it's really an inconvenience because most of our cattle producers don't do that full time. So they work off farm to supplement their income. So they have to take time off work then to come and test their cattle and make sure things are ready for the veterinarian to do the testing and the field staff, because they aren't going to go out and round up all the cattle, and it's expected that the cattle producer have them ready for testing. So it is an inconvenience for them to do that, for sure. They don't have to pay for that. You can, if you want, choose to have a private veterinarian do the testing. And then MDARD works with them to make sure the proper standards are met and procedures are followed. But you could opt to have your own private veterinarian do that if you wanted to. Anything else?
I wonder about if an animal is infected, a deer may be infected. If an animal is infected, can it be eaten, and is there any issue? Is the disease borne through eating it?
Great question. Great question. So we never recommend that a hunter consume an infected deer. If you've submitted the head for testing and we tell you that it's positive, we will issue a replacement tag for an antlerless deer so that you can go shoot another one and replace that meat, and we would recommend that you discard all that meat. However, most people don't get their deer tested. And so, again, there's no way to know by looking at it. I always refresh myself before hunting season, and I didn't do it yet. It's 160 degrees for 20 seconds. I can make sure I provide the correct information. Pretty much cook it until there's no blood and the juices are clear, and that will kill the bacteria. So the lesions and the bacteria are not typically in the muscle tissue in what we would eat. So organ tissue potentially. The way that it would get into a backstrap or some other meat that you might consume is because as you were field dressing or butchering the deer, you somehow cut through a lesion and you moved that bacteria from where it was encapsulated in that lesion into the meat, or your arrow, your broadhead, or your bullet hit that and then transported it through the deer. But it wouldn't naturally on its own just be in the meat. So it's, as long as it's cooked properly, again, then you would kill the bacteria that way.
I have personally seen a deer infected like that.
Yes.
And it looks like, just like this, it's white.
Yes.
The rib cage is white, it's just not pretty.
No, it is not. It doesn't look like something you want to eat
White
for
might be
sure.
pretty sometimes, but this white is, and it has a little, it almost looks like it's,
Like pimply almost sometimes, or
yeah.
Well, how does it travel to the head? I mean, you said you asked the deer hunters just to bring in the head. So if the body had, but I thought it showed up in the rib cage first.
That's a good question. I do not know the epidemiology behind that, but I would imagine it has to do with the deer's immune system, and because the deer is ingesting or inhaling the bacterium, then it's coming through, orally or nasally, and so that's where, kind of like if we get an infection somewhere, like our lymph node near that area is likely to swell, and so because they're ingesting or inhaling it, those lymph nodes then are where the immune system is first forming that reaction.
Doctors usually check the lymph nodes where? Here?
For people or for critters?
Well, both.
I don't know about people. That I don't know.
Lymph nodes are up here.
It's so kind of where they're.
Your head, the same thing with the head.
There's three sets that we look at in the lab, and the big ones are kind of where their tonsils are.
Yeah.
And so that's where it first shows up. Again, I assume it's not being a veterinarian, I assume that it's because of the same reason like with people, those first lymph nodes closest in the circulation of that lymphatic system is where that shows up first. And in people,
I've had deer tested like that when I went downstate.
yeah.
They take things in your zipper right there.
Yep, we leave a couple inches so we don't potentially cut through those, and that's where we're looking. For people, you may have gotten a TB test before you can get a skin test or a blood test. Similar to what we do in cattle, they can take a blood test or we can do a skin test. I just got mine to make sure I don't have TB from working at the deer check station. So in 72 hours, hopefully no bump shows up there and I'm good. And that would again indicate that you would have a latent infection. So it's in my body, I don't know, and the only way I know is by them injecting the tuberculin in my arm. And then if there's a reaction to it, if there's a raised area, that means my body's been fighting it and it knows what to do. And so I get a reaction there because my body is fighting the tuberculin that was injected right there in my arm. So in 72 hours from that, I go back and hopefully there's no bump and they say I'm good. It's not hiding out in me.
Where's your office at?
I work out of both the Gaylord Customer Service Center and then 2 days a week. I usually, pre-COVID, was at the Alpena office on 4343 West M32 there. I do know them, yes. Yes, I do. Yes, and they could, tell you just as much, and more about all their experiences.
Yeah, don't
Very
quote
good.
them.
Thank you.
Oh, you're so very welcome. Thank you.